Only the other day. Oopsie daisy, there we go. Only just the other day, I was reading this in the ESV for the first time, which I'm glad you read it in the ESV, Mike, because I reckon this reads like a letter you could have from any one of your brothers and sisters or friends, almost the way that it's written. It's one of my favorite little just droplets into the mind of Paul as it comes to help us understand how he interacted with people and how he communicated with people that he was very close to. And there's actually a whole lot here that we can learn about when it comes to communication skills, which if you are like me and work in the corporate world, there's a massive amount of training that we do around how to communicate effectively with people. So what I wanted to do today was just to go through it a little bit verse by versey, but also with some ways of thinking about what had to be in place, or what types of conversations or situations or speculation about what was happening behind the scenes to help us sort of go, okay, well, what is actually happening here? Why is it that he wrote this letter? Because there's a bunch that helps us when it comes to how we treat each other and ultimately what we can learn to be more like Christ. So let's get into it. Essentially, when we're faced with a tough conversation, when we're faced with difficult relationship issues, when the stakes are quite high, generally opinions are various and emotions are pretty strong. And when we face these situations, we can generally approach them in two different ways. We can either run from them, we can avoid them. We can handle them poorly, or we can face them and then handle them well. And so this is the funny thing about the way that humans work, is the more crucial, the more, there's a book called Crucial Conversations, which actually I've used as a reference point for this and a few other different classes, because it's a really handy tool. But what they essentially say in that book is the higher the emotional stakes, or the more crucial the need to retain the relationship, the less likely we are to handle it well if we don't go through a correct process. We will do a couple of different things as humans. We will, a lot of the time, we'll go silent and not just not say anything and completely shut down, or we go silent and then we explode out a little bit. And essentially, we move between either silence or violence. And we either don't handle the conversation well, or we don't handle the conversation at all. And so what we can potentially do is attack other people's ideas and feelings. And when we fail in that conversation, in that interaction, it can actually affect everything. It can affect our communities, our careers, our relationships, and in some cases, our health even. So what we're going to find out, and if you have looked at Philemon before, fantastic little study, but what we're going to find out tonight is the correct way to approach a difficult conversation, one that actually legally was completely, Philemon was completely in the right. So, and Paul was trying to approach it from the spirit of Christ, and he's communicating with him in a way to redeem Onesimus back to him. So important before we start, a bit of background, just as a real reminder. So when Paul's writing this letter, he's on house arrest. He's allowed to have visitors. He was guarded. He kept himself busy preaching, writing letters to people in the area, to the ecclesias around the area. And as he talks about here in the book, in the letter here, obviously because of God's providence, he comes across Onesimus as part of what he's in prison, and he meets him, and he brings him into the truth. He teaches him the gospel, and he becomes a brother in Christ. Now, Onesimus was a slave. Now, a slave back in that time was pretty normal, and he had stolen money from Philemon. He'd been a slave in Philemon's house. He'd stolen money and run away. And at the time, that was legally completely punishable by death. So Onesimus had committed a capital offence. He'd gone all the way to Rome and been converted by Paul, and now Paul's writing a letter to Philemon asking him to take Onesimus back. And you can imagine, as good of a guy that Philemon was, it was still a tough pill to follow. So we can't actually just look at it and go, oh, you know, Paul's in the right and Philemon just had to take his lumps. Paul's writing this in a very specific, intentional way, because Philemon is in all respects correct. He had the right to do whatever he wanted to do with Onesimus, given the status differentiation between the two and the time period that it was written, and the event happened. So, as part of being in house arrest, he wrote this letter in that time, and funnily enough, he also wrote another letter at the same time to the Colossians. The book of Colossians was written at the same time, and we know this because in Colossians chapter 4, and you can write a little note here or at the top of the heading if you want to of Philemon. Colossians chapter 4 verse 7, Paul tells the Colossian ecclesia that he's sending Tychicus and Onesimus to the Colossians. And so in all likelihood, what Paul probably did is he probably took both letters and he gave them to Tychicus and was like, hey, make sure when you get to Colossae, make sure that Philemon gets his letter and he can mull it over with the ecclesia, and he can digest it before the ecclesia reads the whole main letter written to them, which is the book of Colossians. And I speculate that because I think the way that Paul's written the letter to Philemon, I would assume, given the level of tact and polish in it, that he probably planned out the way that the letter should be delivered in the most correct way, so that it was received the correct, in how he intended it to be received. And so what's going to happen is Onesimus is going to turn up, in Colossae with Tychicus and two letters, one to Philemon, one to the ecclesia. But the letter to Philemon is also addressed to the ecclesia. So you'll notice in verse 1 and 2, he's talking, to Philemon, to Apphia, our sister, and Archippus, and also the ecclesia in your house. And so what the reason for that is because you think about the types of potential situations that happen in an ecclesia that affect one person, they also affect the wider ecclesia as well. And so it's almost like, hey, digest this, accept Onesimus back, and then digest and absorb the information from the letter that he's written specifically to the Colossian ecclesia, which is more doctrinal and helpful for encouragement, because this is dealing with one specific situation. So he's dealing with the acceptance of Onesimus back, get past that, accept that, and then move on to the matter of hand, which is, the more heavier things in the book of Colossians. Because you imagine, like, the people, if Paul didn't write this letter, the ecclesia is gonna, they're gonna have these, almost the rumor mill will start, and why hasn't he punished Onesimus? What's he doing back? What's this guy doing here? So, it's I think it's really important to understand that the two were delivered at the same time for a very specific reason. They were more than likely read in a certain order. So, a nice little tidbit there. A little bit additional background. Verse 2, Apphia, sister, and Archippus, we don't know who they are, but we assume that maybe Apphia was Philemon's wife, and I speculate that maybe she's included directly and called out at the start of the letter, because in those days the wives had a lot more to do with the slaves in the house than the men did in many respects, and maybe Archippus is his son. We don't necessarily know that, if maybe it's just a family friend or something like that, but obviously he's an important member of the ecclesia. Now, in Colossians, and it's funny that Paul addresses this letter to Archippus as well and calls him out by name, because in Colossians, when the other letter that he wrote at the same time, he actually speaks to Archippus directly in that letter, and he's like, hey, act on your responsibilities and fulfill your duties in the ecclesia. So maybe that's why he's saying like, hey, make sure you fill in your dad's, if he's Philemon's son, maybe fill in your dad's job as his dad's getting older. So just a little bit of information about the people it's addressed to. So the other thing is we need to remember when firstly, I said that Philemon's in the right legally, but the other thing is we need to remember that Philemon, just because he was legally in the right, he was also a godly man. We know he was really generous and really loving as a person. So verse 4, I thank my God always when I remember you in my prayers, because I hear of your love and of the faith you have towards the Lord Jesus and for all the saints. And I pray that the sharing of your faith may become effective for the full knowledge of every good thing that is in us for the sake of Christ. Paul's language is emotive. We know Paul prayed a lot, and he's always thankful to God for Philemon. Philemon's actions affected Paul because even though Paul wanted to be everywhere all at once, in some respects Philemon is being what Paul wanted to be to this ecclesia, but obviously couldn't be there because he's in prison. And so by being like Paul, Paul is sort of he's reaching out to Philemon to go, hey, look, this relationship we've built, this camaraderie and this similarity of focus and goal. Let's just use that commonality. He's drawing on that commonality of faith and direction to then set up his communication that he's trying to give to him about Onesimus in verse 8 onwards. And he sets the baseline by just, I guess, calling to attention the commonality between the two. Now, he's not just calling out love for Philemon. He's not just saying, hey, this is like a really good Christ-like behavior. What this is it's a bit of a psychological masterpiece in the way that he's setting up the letter, because he wants to make sure that what he actually is writing it for lands with the correct way, because it's mutually beneficial to Paul, to Philemon, to the ecclesia. And so he's saying, hey, take what I'm about to tell you and ask you in the intent that I mean it. And he's doing it by framing up verse 4 through 7. And here's a part of how we the type of relationship. This is how we know this, is because of the type of relationship that Paul and Philemon had, because he says in verse 8, he says, accordingly, though I am bold enough in Christ to command you to do what is required, yet for love's sake I prefer to appeal to you. He's essentially saying, look, hey, I could just tell you to take Onesimus back, but because I respect you, and it might be more convenient for me to tell you to just take Onesimus back. But because he loves him and because he respects him and because he respects what he does for the ecclesia, he actually wants to appeal to him about how he treats Onesimus. And you think about this when it comes to how God interacts with us. God gives us certain commands and directions and things we are required to do, but he doesn't dictate to us what our response has to be. He wants us to voluntarily change. He reaches out to us with love and kindness and wants us to respond in faith. Now, this is, I guess, a nice little tidbit as well when it comes to thinking through the story, is that in this situation, Paul is old. He is a prisoner, and he puts this into the letter in verse 9 very deliberately to say that, hey, look, I would love to be able to come and have this conversation with you myself. But I'm a prisoner and I'm old and I can't necessarily maybe travel as easily. and it's going to be a while before I get out of prison anyway. So he's like, hey, I'm going to have to send this letter instead. And he's sort of, again, reinforcing the respect and love that he has for Philemon by saying, look, I'd really rather say, like, tell you this in person, but I'm writing the letter, in lieu of it. Now, it's the grounding in cooling Philemon's love and his faith to the surface, and then saying, hey, I could command you, but I want to, out of respect, request from you. And then, hey, also, I'd like to say it in person. So he's actually showing us exactly how, when we have a difficult conversation, how we should go through it. And if you put this into sort of human terms, if you put yourself into the position of Philemon, you've got this slave who's run away and stolen from you, and then he shows up with this letter, and he's looking at this letter from Paul going, hang on, what do you mean, like, you could dictate me or tell me what to do? I'm legally correct. And he's like, he better not, think he can just tell me what to do with my own slave type of thing. And then he's like, oh yeah, but he's told me he appreciates me. He's told me I'm doing the right thing. He respects me. My hard work's being recognized. All those types of thoughts start creeping in as he's reading through the letter. And it's so important for us to, think about this type of communication style when we're communicating with, people either in the ecclesia or even at work, going through it from a tactical and loving and respectful way like this. You get a lot more bees with honey than, I don't know, what's the saying, vinegar or something or other. This is exactly what's happening here. It's a wonderful, simple message, but it's so powerful at the same time. And so he then says to him, when he starts talking about Onesimus, he says to Philemon, receive him. The King James kind of makes it a bit more graphic. He's like, receive him as you would receive my bowels. He's like, literally, I like the New King James. It makes a bit more sense. It says like the vital organs, the inward parts. It's like, treat it as though it's an essential part of my own body, like you're holding my liver or my heart or something like that keeps me alive. That's how he's explaining to Philemon how important Onesimus is to him. And what he also says, and this again reinforces the respect, reinforces the love he has for Philemon. In verse 13, he says, look, I could have just kept him. I could have kept Onesimus with me, but out of respect, I'm sending him back. And in all reality, Philemon probably wouldn't even find out for years later that Onesimus was kicking around with Paul if he'd just stayed with him. But again, by putting himself out there and sending Onesimus back, he's keeping the relationship whole by being open and transparent. And if you think about the practicalities of that, Paul's under house arrest, and Onesimus was probably running errands for him or getting stuff for him, helping him out, helping him do his preaching and organizing stuff for him. So, like, for Paul to give up Onesimus as an asset to him and send him back out of respect for Philemon, it again reinforces that the action matches the word, and obviously that would be really valuable and powerful for Philemon. And so, we don't know what happens with Onesimus, and in all reality, he says in verse 14, look, I would love to keep him, but not without your consent. So maybe Onesimus went back to Paul and kept serving him at some point, or maybe it was just purely for the reconciliation for Onesimus and Philemon to reconcile, and then they served in the Colossian ecclesia together. We don't know, but it's the point of this is that it's important to make sure that the relationships we have, if they are fractured, are particularly in the ecclesia, are mended in some form or other. There's no point if when we're interacting with people and for instance Paul sends him back and they don't get along, that he goes, oh, you know what, I don't accept it because Paul and Onesimus are he just wants to have him back or whatever. So the approach that Philemon is having in the interaction has to have been one of one, having the relationship with Paul, that he's taking the letter in the right way, but secondarily, he must have been a godly enough man that when he receives it, he then is seeing from Paul how important this guy is, and that, if he wanted to send Onesimus back to keep serving Paul, he would, but he has to be given the opportunity to do that. You have to mend those relationships to begin with. You can't just expect someone to be okay with, if Paul sent him a letter and says, hey, Onesimus is with me, he's a good lad, sorry, he stole some stuff and ran away, look, I'll pay for it. He goes one step further and says, no, you need to go back and I'll advocate for you through the letter, but you need to, fix that yourself. Those relationships need to be mended. And obviously, in doing that, the relationship between Philemon and Paul is kept whole, Onesimus and Philemon are reconciled, and then the relationship with Paul and Onesimus can be even more powerful, whether they served each other or just kept in contact, because there's nothing going on. There's full transparency. Now, it would also, I think the other thing is, and I think this is why the greater picture of it, it would also be a massively encouraging moment for the ecclesia, because you think about all the drama that would have happened in the ecclesia when Onesimus stole money and ran away. The ecclesia met in Philemon's house, so everyone would have known who he was, so it affected everyone. And so by Onesimus coming back, he gets to sort of, he has to admit to his mistakes and front up for it, but it's also a really good opportunity, it's a wonderful opportunity for Philemon to demonstrate the characteristics that Paul is complimenting him for, and then for the whole ecclesia to be strengthened, uplifted because of his choice to voluntarily, reconcile and forgive Onesimus. So that's the way that Paul sets the letter up for Philemon to respond. Now, the most important thing, and I think the most powerful part of the whole letter, is a little comment in verse 15, which is Paul going, well, it's not necessarily our control why he ran away. Like, he starts speculating a little bit as to why we think he ran away. He's almost saying, like, you know what, God might have put this in place so that Onesimus could be redeemed and could be brought into the truth, because clearly sitting in the house and serving in the house where the whole ecclesia is meeting and being around the ecclesia wasn't getting through to Onesimus for one reason or other, and he needed a different influence or a different teacher, which he found in Paul and learned the truth that way. And so he sort of says, you know what, perhaps this is why he was parted from you. Maybe this is why he ran away, that you might have him back forever. Not as a servant or a slave, but more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother, especially to me, being Paul, and much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. And it's wonderful because this is sort of like the final nail in the coffin for Philemon, if he hadn't got the point at this point, is that if he is truly the man of love and faith that Paul thinks he is, he actually doesn't have a choice, in a sense, not from a lack of legal obligation, but doesn't have a choice in the sense that if we are required to treat our brothers and sisters in a specific way, and Onesimus is in fact his brother now. So it's wonderful because Paul's masterpiece of language, he's weaving together the best interests of Philemon into the letter. He's stating, like, Paul's telling Philemon that, like, Onesimus is even better of a servant now. He's been taught the principles of living the truth means also, when you're a slave, serving your master. It actually makes him a better servant when he comes back to Philemon by learning the truth and becoming a brother. He can still be a brother, he can still serve him, but he'll do it even better because he's doing it for the right reasons. He's not doing it because he's just the servant in the house. He's also like honoring God through his actions and interactions in the household as his role in life as a servant in the house. And so Paul gives to Philemon a better slave, a better servant, and a new brother. And ultimately, this is wonderful for Onesimus as well, because Philemon was well known for looking after the ecclesia, of which Onesimus was one of them, and more than likely, given his character, probably looked after his servants quite well as well. And so, even though it was potentially really hard for Philemon to maybe put his pride to one side and stomach it, he ultimately benefited as a result of it, but I'm not saying it would have been easy. So you think about the situation when he comes back. He obviously was wealthy, which means Onesimus wasn't his only slave. If he didn't punish Onesimus in some way or make an example of him, he could risk potentially having a household full of slaves that are rebellious. If they were to perceive him as a sort of a weak master, he might risk losing control of the house, and that's obviously not a good thing either. And Paul's almost addresses this in a sense where he's appealing to Philemon's his character by going, you know what, your love for the ecclesia is such that you'll be okay with this. You know that these type of character traits will overpower the seeming weakness that you would get by showing love. Again, you get more bees with honey than vinegar or whatever it is. And so it's really important for us, just as important as it is for us to know how to have a hard conversation and learn from how Paul wrote it. But it's just as important for us to learn how to receive that tough conversation, that difficult conversation, accepting that one, it's hard for the person to have it with you, and also to be humble enough to receive the correction and the criticism. And so Paul and Onesimus already had gone through this process of writing the letter, and now Onesimus has to put humility together and front up and deliver the letter. And so without the three of them having the correct approach to the situation, Paul in the way he writes the letter and the humility in which he writes it, and Onesimus parking his own pride and his own fears, and Philemon actually going, you know what, I'm in the right, but I'm going to try and act in a Christ-like way, this whole thing would fall apart. And so Philemon's biggest struggle was to trust that God's thinking, God's love, God's righteousness would always win over human thinking and his potential house management issues, or the law that he was obviously completely entitled to following through on. And so ultimately here, he being Paul, he says, he starts giving us this wonderful symbolism, which obviously is why we're studying it. It's about he echoes the language of mediatorship, and he's acting as Christ for Onesimus in verses 17 to 21. He asks that Philemon treat Onesimus the way that Philemon would treat Paul if Paul himself came. And he says, look, that debt that he owes you, put it on my account. And all these types of wonderful language that echo the way that Christ mediates for us. And he says in verse 21 and 22, when you read through that, it's almost like he's saying, look, I've previously stated how much my heart is filled with the happiness at the thought of all the thing you do in the ecclesia. Let me feel that same happiness. Let me feel just as excited about what you do in your ecclesia by the way that you treat Onesimus. He's almost saying, look, I know you're a godly man, and I'm confident that because you are who you are, even though this is a unique situation, you will still do everything that I've asked you to do, and even more than I asked you to do, which is just a wonderful a wonderful sort of little bow on the story. And so let's look at it from quickly, just as we finish. Let's look at the application aspect of it. So if we are in the position of Paul, so I'm going to look at this from the three different perspectives that we just talked about. So you've got the perspective of Paul, you've got the perspective of Philemon, and the perspective of Onesimus. If we find ourselves ever in the position of Paul, where we feel that we have to correct or guide or coach our brothers and sisters or someone we're interacting with from doing something wrong, we have to approach it with respect and love and humility. We shouldn't be pulling them aside and lecturing them. Paul could have done that if he wanted to, but we know, and we know he did on a couple of occasions. We know specifically he tells us about one in Galatians where he reprimanded the Apostle Peter. So he was perfectly comfortable doing that. But here, he obviously knew that was the wrong approach. And he didn't flaunt his authority in the ecclesia. He appeals in love. He talks directly to Philemon's strengths in having his own love for the ecclesia in Colossae. And so when we think about that, when we think about how we talk to our brothers and sisters, focus on the respect aspect of it, focus it from the humility aspect, and ultimately from a place of love. You know, if we respect our brothers and sisters, if we love them and treat them as we would like to be treated if we were in their situation, and we do it with humility, and I just own up that we are all actually sinners, then it just happens in a way more effective way, as we can see the letter in the way that it's written. Now, from Philemon's perspective, sometimes, and sometimes we feel this, whether we are right or not, but sometimes we feel that we're completely in the right. And sometimes by human thinking we can justify it, or sometimes legally we are 100% in the right, like Philemon is, and we want punishment for the person. What we sometimes forget to do, particularly with our brothers and sisters, is to pump the brakes, take a step back, and realize that God has a purpose in everything He's doing. In this story, what should have happened if God wasn't involved is Onesimus would have been caught and put to death, funnily enough, which is not funny at all. Like, it's just that's the sad reality of this time. And Philemon would have been completely justified in this, and he, by doing it, his own human instinct for needing management, he would want his house under control. But because he is approaching this from the perspective of forgiveness and love and humility, he's able to embrace Onesimus as a fellow brother, and because Paul draws on the love of Christ at the end of the letter, he is able to show Christ's love to the ecclesia in the house, to his own family, to Onesimus, to the traveling people that would hear the story, and ultimately, preach even more and more of a powerful preaching tool. Think about how the story would have got out through Colossae that this Christian house of people that are meeting had a returned slave, where normally it ends in death. He's just accepted his slave back, and they're all happy and celebrating together. Like, that's different. That's unique. That's so strange. Okay, now last one. Onesimus. When we think about him, gratitude. 100% he needs gratitude. He also needs humility, and he also needs to have a massive amount of trust. All right? When we join the ecclesia, when we come into the family of God, we still have responsibilities. We still have to own our errors, our mistakes, whether they were before we join the family, afterwards, whatever it is. And so even though Onesimus was baptized and part of the ecclesia, and yes, he's forgiven, he still has obligations. He's still Philemon's slave. He still has broken the law, and he has to own up to it. He has to repair that relationship. And so ultimately, he needs to show his humility, show his trust in God, and hope for the forgiveness of Philemon, and ultimately that he'd be treated well, even though he deserved to die. And so when we look at the three different ways that these guys needed to have the correct approach, the one character trait that they actually had to have in common is humility. Because when we approach all these situations from the perspective of humility, it actually makes it all work. Yes, you need love. Yes, you need forgiveness and kindness and patience and things. But ultimately, if you put yourself to one side and humble yourself before other people, it simplifies the whole process. Because humility is the most significant element of forgiveness in all aspects. When we humble ourselves before God, we are able to be forgiven. Because humility is the opposite to pride. When we have pride, what pride does is it's like a selfish gain, but humility is a selfless gain. When we truly humble ourselves and humble others, humble ourselves to esteem other people more greatly than ourselves, it is putting others greater than us. Humility is our ability to see things from others' perspectives. It's not about rolling over and allowing others to take advantage of you. It's the conduit to love. It's putting people ahead of you to allow God to do the work. And this is actually how God is able to forgive us. I love Psalm 104. Psalm 104 is wonderful. It shows us when we have humility, what is God capable of doing. Psalm 104 verse 10, he says, "He has not dealt with us according to our sins, nor punished us according to our iniquities. For as the heavens is high above the earth, so great is his mercy toward those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. As a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him. For he knows our frame and he remembers that we are dust." So we think about ourselves as Onesimus. We regularly steal. We regularly run away from our master and our father. Every time we use our time to do stuff that's wrong, we sin and we move further into debt with him. Every time we return to him, he's willing to forgive us and to remove those debts from us. And he does that by the sacrifice of his son. The sacrifice of his son, which is represented in the bread and wine, is the outworking of the forgiveness offered to us if we are humble enough to ask for it. If we are humble enough to realize we are undeserving of the gift we've been given. So I hope that was encouraging and you enjoyed the study of Philemon as much as I did.
Thanks very much, Brother Ben. Just get this back again.